I wanted to circle back just briefly to we had such a rich conversation about the woman at the well. And I don't think that we all necessarily agreed, nor do we need to, on sort of her moral fiber, perhaps, right? There are different interpretations of that. And so I thought that I would just briefly, this is probably a reminder or material you already know for many of you. But as we engage in this work of reading the text and interpreting the text for our lives, making meaning for ourselves, we do that in a variety of ways. And we join in a rich tradition and history of doing that. That involves, Tim and I had a brief conversation about that on Sunday, but it involves both our head and our heart. And I think what I am very much enjoying about our group Bible study is that we are engaging both our heart and our head, and that those two things enrich one another. So as we approach our text and we think about what theology is, right, trying to say things that are true about God, who is very mysterious and beyond our full knowing, yet we still know things about God, that as we do that work, that Jesus Christ, sort of the Christian agreement is that Jesus Christ is our, yardstick for doing theology, right? That we may not agree on many things, but we do agree that something special happened with Jesus Christ when we think about theological traditions. And as we seek to do the work of theology, you may be familiar with the three-legged stool. Does anybody know the three-legged stool, right? So there's scripture, reason, and tradition. I think you often, if you Google three-legged stool, you often get a lot of Episcopalian websites, but throughout Christian history, those were sort of the three sources of knowing who God is: scripture, tradition, and reason. And then there, in the 18th century, and then we started to see the inclusion of experience. Now, I'm a United Methodist, so I'm going to attribute that to John Wesley, but perhaps it wasn't just Wesley. But it's called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral in the circles that I travel in. But that experience was added as sort of that fourth source of how do we know who God is. And so as we look at a text like the Samaritan Woman, and we begin to think about, who she was and what her life might have been like, we have scripture, we have Christian tradition, we have other commentaries, we have scientific and logical reasoning, and we have our own personal experience. And the wonderful thing about doing this sort of work in a group is that we can enrich one another's perspectives. And so I just thought I'd kind of give that reminder of, how we do theology, and say what a blessing it is to do theology with all of you every Wednesday. So
my thought on that is that although we had disagreements about her moral status, all of us agreed, and all of the commentaries agree, that she was a marginal person doing a act of labor, manual labor, going to the well to get the water, in contrast to Nicodemus, who was a big shot. And Nicodemus did not accept Jesus and went there under cover of darkness, and then returned, and then later did not acknowledge that he had met Jesus, whereas the woman, although somewhat of a simple-minded person, did accept Jesus, albeit with some misunderstandings, and ran back to the village and brought people to be with Jesus, and Jesus remained there for a couple of days, a point that Herb mentioned last week that he thought was important, and I agree. So I think with that summary, that would take in all of us.
Yes, agreed. Thank you. That was a beautiful way to phrase that. And I think that our perspectives are all enriched by one another. So thank you. And thank you also for bringing up this concept of darkness and light and noonday and cover of night. I will just share, a little bit of Alma Thomas. She titled her paintings after she painted them, which I find quite fascinating. But this one is called "Morning in the Bowl of Night," which I thought was just such a beautiful phrase. Beautiful phrase. And I thought I would place it here and say, is there anything that that either this painting or the title connects with John, or anything that we would like to bring up that has arisen in the last week in terms of connections we've made with John, the Gospel according to John? And it's okay if not, but I thought I would just offer that. So I know we reflect on these words all week long. All right. So I don't see any thoughts, but I love that, morning in the bowl of night.
It doesn't reach me.
No?
I think it's okay. It just doesn't.
That's okay.
I'm probably more moved by music than art, but it doesn't do anything for me.
I'm moved by poetry more than art, and I think the title is poetic, Morning in the Bowl of Night. It's my favorite time of day before the sun has come up, and you can just start to see the light coming through trees or something like that.
It's also a good time to sleep.
Yeah, and it's also true that in John, what I think is interesting about Alma Thomas is that she has this very particular style of painting, small blobs of paint that, to my untrained eye, don't always look like, a thing. They don't look like a thing. But I think there is some order and some mysterious beauty to them. And so I think there's something about that connection with John, right? That ability that as Jesus is revealed for who he is, that it is this mysterious coming together. People don't quite see it right away. So maybe I'm stretching a little bit, but there's definitely that theme of light and dark that happens in John as people begin to understand who Jesus really is. So we'll just keep, I always like to have something beautiful to break up the, the slides too. If nothing else, we've got beauty. And so John chapter 6 is where we'll spend most of our time today. Very familiar, feeding the 5,000, walking on water. And then there's this quite long dialogue and discourse on the bread of life, which we will not read the entire thing, but we will look at it for clues. And if you want to read it again, then you can, but we'll get to kind of the main point. I heard someone say yesterday, it's someone on staff, I won't call them out, but they said, John can ramble. So John rambles a little bit.
Well, I'm glad somebody on the staff said that, because I thought he was awfully verbose, and for a lawyer to say that, that's really something. The discourses are quite repetitive, and it almost looks like the author wrote some of the discourse parts at different times, pasted them all together, and just couldn't give up any of the many permutations of saying the same thing. So kept them all.
Yes, that is true. That is true. Is there someone who'd like to begin our reading today? John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14.
I can do it.
Thank you, Nancy.
Feeding the 5,000. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are that among so many people? You're on.
You're muted.
Thank you.
Well, there you
Thank
go.
you. And we'll continue the story here, but one of the things I was going to mention is as we read this text today, look for clues or connections with the Exodus story as we're reading today. Let's see. And I'll let someone else finish the last few verses of this story through verse 14.
I'll do it. So Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, This is indeed the prophet who is to come unto the world.
Thank you. So yes, as you look at these verses or this story in 1 through 14, did you notice anything about the Exodus story or any connections to that? And I will also note, so this is the one miracle story. You probably read this in your notes, but this is the one miracle story that is included in all 4 of the Gospels. So that is kind of an interesting thing. But
I believe Luke put it in twice. 2,000 the second time, 5,000 the first time.
Right.
But I think it's probably just the same story. So the commentaries, because I wouldn't have thought of this on my own, talk about how in Exodus there was manna from heaven, and this is bread being provided by Jesus. And then later in the discourses, becomes more evident that there's a connection to Exodus when Jesus himself talks about Moses didn't provide the manna, it came from God, but whoever ate that bread died, and whoever eats basically my bread or later my flesh will live forever.
Right.
So it became obvious the connection to Exodus, but at this point I would have missed it.
Right. Well, and we have here, John frames everything or most things within the Jewish festivals, right? So now the Passover, which is the celebration of the Exodus, right? Being putting the blood of the lamb on the front door and the angel of death passing over those houses so the Hebrew people could leave Egypt. So in terms of the narrative, John alludes to it there as well. And then we have the bread.
What I thought was interesting, I think I mentioned I've been trying to read Exodus at this, I haven't read it all the way through, and I've been doing that. And one thing that stood out to me is that verse 12, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. And the only reason that stands out to me is because I've been reading Exodus, and that was noteworthy is the fragments, gather up the fragments so that nothing will be lost. That's exactly what Moses said to the Israelites when the manna came down. Don't leave anything to waste. It's directly pulled out of Exodus. Mm-hmm. So Jesus has all this in mind when he's preaching his gospel. And it's interesting that it happens during Passover. So a real connection, like you're saying, Christine.
And even if Jesus didn't say that, the author of John was well aware of Exodus and may have put it in for parallelism.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
Right. And there's also this allusion or this naming of Jesus, who is this Jesus person who's arrived? And, here this is the prophet, right? And the readers of John would have recognized Moses as a prophet as well. So there's these kind of rich connections.
So it seems like the people recognize Jesus as a prophet, and obviously these disciples who've left everything feel that he is their teacher. But I'm struck by the verses. Let's assume those two disciples were representatives of all the problem solving they did. No one said, well, Jesus, you've turned water into wine. Jesus, you've done these other signs and miracles. What do you think we could do? What can you do? They all start talking about, either problems. We don't have enough money or we don't have enough food. So well, obviously it says that it was a test and they did not do well on the test.
I have a different take on that. All four Gospels, and I'm more familiar with the synoptics than I am John, but all of them portray the disciples as fairly dense and people who, now they were simple people, I suppose, but there had to be some substance to Peter to be able to, be the founder of the church after the resurrection. But I think the authors use the ignorance of the disciples to then Jesus will introduce ideas. So the disciples are somewhat of a foil for Jesus, and the dialogue between the dense disciples and the all-knowing Jesus, that dialogue reveals to the reader aspects about Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, I think that's a device, that the author of John uses, right? That who understands who Jesus is at first and who doesn't. And then there's this sort of interplay and this contrast between those who understand and those who don't. And it's often the people that we don't expect to understand who Jesus is who do. Right. So thank you both. And this is a familiar story. We probably all learned it as one of our first Sunday school stories, right? But John has a particular take on it. Any other thoughts before we, on this feeding the 5,000? I don't want to rush us.
Well, I think the other thing is it's like a communion. It's, those most special moments, I think, in the gospel are where Jesus is breaking bread with people he loves.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and so one of the interesting things as we approach Holy Week as a church, and we loosely follow the lectionary, but we're following the lectionary right now, and this is year C, I think. I always forget the letters, and we've been reading John through Lent, and then we'll read John on Maundy, Thursday, but John doesn't have a Last Supper narrative, and yet John, there's this sort of Eucharistic sacramental quality in this bread story, especially here in chapter 6, and that's a unique part of John, and a gift of having 4 Gospels. One of which is a little bit different. So, all right.
I was having some technical difficulties, so I don't know if it was a mention that after feeding the 5,000, it didn't gain a lot of followers. And so the lesson, to me, the lesson through the apostles and the disciples is that miracle working is not going to do it. And because we're trying to get the spirit within people to come to, well, we call coming to Christ, but coming to God. And so that's my, to me, that's the major lesson I take from this episode.
So Christine, are we still in the early ministry? Because I think what John Hales was talking about was Jesus's followers, few in number, and then they grew over time. So are we, where are we now? Are we in the middle, or are we still in the early, or let's say the first third of his ministry?
Yeah, I think we're probably, approaching the midway point, but we're not there yet. I think this is still ministry to a few people. Yeah. Well, thank you. And then, so this idea of, as we do theology, right, and we're thinking about what is atonement, and John has a particular way of presenting that. I liked this quote that I read in my commentary, this red one, Gale O'Day, but it's the life and ministry of Jesus now recreate and regenerate the Exodus. The liberation and freedom of the Exodus is now newly available in the gracious abundance of Jesus. So I think that's where we see sort of the unique quality of John's theology of being one with God, that it can be about liberation and liberation from sin. And it's also this living abundantly in the life of Jesus. And that's not the only take, but I thought that this connection with Exodus was sort of helpful here. And now from bread, John moves us back to water. Herb, would you read this? Let's see, this is verses 15 through 21.
Yeah, sure. When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going.
Sorry, I went backwards there and forwards. So, well, I'll let you all start. Is there anything that particularly stood out to you? I will also say that that the author is still alluding to the Exodus story here in this story of water.
What is the first sentence? I don't remember that. Who is trying to make him king?
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't pick up on that one when I was reading through it. Did anyone else have some thoughts or ideas?
Well, the New Interpreter's Bible thought that was an important point because it shows the failure of the crowd to understand what sort of kingdom Jesus wanted to establish. So the commentary says that in verse 15, Jesus displays his omniscience by knowing in advance the crowd's intent. The people's desire to make Jesus king by force resolves the ambiguity of verse 14 and confirms that the people's response cannot be trusted. The kingship of Jesus is an important theme in the fourth gospel, first introduced in the first chapter. Israel's desire for a king is part of its messianic expectations, the hope for a second David. Jesus will be king in the fourth gospel, but he will not be king according to his definition of kingship, not forced to fit into the world's definition. the kingship theme reaches its resolution in the crucifixion narrative of John, chapters 18 and 19.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So we have Moses. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say there are plenty of commentaries out there to be found, by theologians that Jesus became the king on the cross. That's, when he fully gave everything he had, that is who he was. It was giving himself. However you want to look at, why he did that, that's where he became king. That's the definition. But there's a lot of commentaries that support, run parallel to what Tim was saying.
Right. And so we have those ideas of, prophet, priest, and king, right? And how is Jesus, he's seen as a prophet, but he's different. He's seen as a king like David, but he's more, right? Like, so yeah, go ahead, John, Don Farnsworth, you were going to say something.
All I was saying is you're exactly right in my mind, Herb. It's his timing. He avoided their asking him to be king when it wasn't time.
Mm-hmm.
But not only was it not time, it was the wrong concept of kingship.
Right.
Because they wanted basically a soldier like David. And that's not the kingdom and kingship that Jesus was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by, and I have a sort of an obsession over this, where you see in verse 20, but he said to them, "It is I." In the footnote, it says, in the Greek, it's "I am," not "it is I." And in the Oxford Study Bible, let's see, "I am" in Greek means that I am a being who is both eternal in the past and imperishable in the future.
Mm.
And as I understand it, to say "I am" in Judea was blasphemous, because only a deity could say that. And I believe that Yahweh is Greek for "you are," and that's what the Jews could say, "You are Yahweh," which then got anglicized to Jehovah. But anyway, I think the "I am" is interesting. And there's a chart in one of my books talking about the "I am" sayings where there's a predicate nominative. I am the life, I am the bread. And then there are "I am" sayings where there isn't one. It's just "I am."
Right.
And there must be about 20 of these listed.
Right. And so that "I am" statement, right? Moses asked God at the burning bush, "Who are you? And what is your name?" And "I am" is the answer. And so I actually, thank you for bringing that up, Tim. I actually pulled, if you are a person who is intrigued by language sometimes, but maybe not a scholar of Greek like me, I am not, there is a wonderful thing called a Bible Hub that has an interlinear, so you can look verse by verse, and you probably all know this, but here is the "I am" here. It's, how would we pronounce this in Greek? Ego, E-I-M-I, however we would pronounce that in Greek. So that's John 6:20, which we've just read, that "I am." And it's so, yeah, the Bible footnotes will say "it is I" is probably not the best translation of that. And it harkens back to when he is also speaking to the woman at the well, he uses that same phrase, the author of John, right? "I am," same Greek words. So this, and then we are about to go into, I think it's "I am the bread of life." Yes, "I am the bread of life" is the first sort of "I am" statement of Jesus.
Christine, are you saying that this ego eimi is also what is said in Moses in the Hebrew? It's the same.
Well, it wouldn't have been written in Greek,
right?
Right,
but it's the same. I mean, I know these words literally in English, "I am," are the same, but are we saying that this was an intentional quote.
And that's what I'm reading in the commentary, that John is using this language very intentionally. Tim, or is that what you were bringing up as well, that the commentators, yeah.
But he wrote it in Greek. So I think what Diane is asking is, what would Jesus have said in Aramaic that John would have quoted in Greek? Do I have that right, Diane?
Well, I'm just wondering too, all of the ears of the Jews, what would they have heard? Would they have heard the blasphemous statement?
I think they would have, from what I've read in other contexts, that would have been considered blasphemy to say I am. Whereas both the NIV and the New Revised Standard, they both say it is I, which sounds so benign that I think we miss how strong a statement that is.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And then there's also this this allusion or connection with the Exodus story, right? That the Exodus, the sea is parted, and so there's a strong tradition of God having, that water is a symbol of chaos, and God has the power to calm the chaos. So there's that illusion in the water, their water.
And control nature.
Well. Right, and control nature. Which I've read John many, many times, but and that didn't stand out to me until this reading of it.
See, we all learned something today.
Oh yeah, we're learning together all the time. Any other thoughts on walking on water before we head to the discourse on the bread of life? I think that's such a discourse is such an interesting word to me.
If I could interpose, Christine.
Sure.
Could you look at the materials I sent, and I think John Hales will send them to everybody else, and think about it, and then maybe next week when we're reading 7, I would like to know your take on this sequence. I suspect that you'll come out on the side of it doesn't make any difference theologically, but I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'm still going to ask you for your opinion.
Yes, I will check my email after we're off, and I will read it. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. So I also, Alma Thomas, before she painted little small blobs, she did some other words, and I just thought I would put this in here: the stormy sea. So that idea that Jesus is the revelation of God, has God's power to calm the sea.
It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
This one I like a lot.
Oh, good. Yes.
He really has a knack with color, making it look really fierce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yes. Scary.
And perhaps that helps us to imagine, what the disciples would have experienced, right?
When John Hales and I were in Israel, they showed us boats that would have been used back then. And you remember, John, that boat that they pulled up from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee? That
oh yes, that was at the kibbutz.
And just think how scary it would be to be in a boat that small in a rough sea. It's I don't know. Was it?
It sure scared the apostles.
Yeah, it was about 15 feet long, maybe, and just basically a shell.
Yes. Side note.
On the other hand, it had a high prow or bow, and which if you headed into the wind, that's pretty stable. But
yeah, you're more of a nautical person than I am, John.
Yeah,
I'd be scared.
No, but the thing is, it was probably an unusually strong storm. When we were in Israel, I talked to the local fellow there, and I asked him about the winds on the, and he said, well, yes, in late afternoon, the winds come up because the heat of the day has been heating, and so things are rising. And then, there's a gap in the mountains that go to the Mediterranean. And so the change in the temperature of the air rushes through that gap, which he says usually causes these storms that lasts maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then it's calm again. So that to me explains the suddenness of this storm. I don't think it was anything out of anything in contrary to the laws of nature. Anyway, so.
I think also, when I was there, I also heard that same thing. And when we were out on the water, almost every afternoon, it's like the afternoon rains in Florida. It's very common, but this was the middle of the night. I'm not saying there was a supernatural thing going on, but their fear, many of them were fishermen. They wouldn't have been scared of that afternoon storm because that was probably the kind of thing that happened to them all the time. But they were in a little bit of a different situation, and it was nighttime. And again, I think that's one of the reasons this painting is effective, is because of the darkness.
I wonder if John took a little poetic license, because I didn't really think about it being dark. Well, it says when evening came, but Diane points out that this would have been at night, and astute fishermen would have known better, I think, than to go out on the sea at night.
I could also be thinking of other gospels. It's not so strong here. I don't know, Christine.
No, but see, Diane's thought makes me think that there's some author license in telling the story. That could very well have been in the afternoon, like John Hales is talking about. And well, anyway, my thoughts are somewhat jumbled, but I don't read the story literally.
Right. I mean, and the darkness part, we know John uses that reference to darkness and light to relate it to understanding and who is understanding. So, and there was a commentary I read, it says, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. And the commentary I read, it wasn't that they were terrified because they saw that who Jesus was, that it was this theophany. Jesus is God. And so they were terrified because they were seeing God. So maybe that is why the author sets this up in the darkness, that all of a sudden, the disciples realize who Jesus is. Perhaps.
That would certainly match up with Exodus, when those theophany moments happen, and Moses can encounter God face to face, but no one else can. Because,
and that it would be frightening.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Getting back to Moses, I'm sorry, I've had this terrible connection this morning, so I'm in and out of the meeting, so maybe it was covered, but according to the story, Moses said, "Who are you?" And he said, God says, "I am." I like to think that's the only thing God could tell Moses, because that's the only thing Moses could understand. And I got a list of things that we now know about God from Jesus' time with us, which I will send to you and share with you. It's a list of about 15 or 18 things that we now say we can say about God. So our knowledge is expanded. But for Moses, I am was all he could understand.
Right. And we see our knowledge of God expanding through the words of the Gospel of John.
Right.
And yet there's still much that we do not know.
Well, if that's the fun of it. Keep searching.
Yes.
That's the journey.
Yes. So, and looking at our time, I will just sort of highlight that this is just a small part of this very long discourse, where Jesus really, if we were wondering if we were making the Exodus connection or we're reading too much into it, no, Jesus says it was Moses who gave you the bread of life, right? So, so all of chapter 6 really alludes to the Exodus story. And it was Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, and my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life, right? And so it's this understanding of bread, much like living water. It's something else. It's John's interpretation of eternal life, what that means to live in God's presence here and now. And I think that's a very familiar phrase to us. I am the bread of life. So I will invite you, if you'd like to read through that longer discourse, you are certainly welcome to. And then I will point us where we're headed. So chapters 7 through 9 are all take place at the Festival of Booths. And I know at the beginning we were talking about Jewish festivals and traditions and how interesting those are, and how they also in John sort of frame the narrative of this story. So if you'd like to look into a little bit more about what the Festival of Booths is, it's also called the Festival of Tabernacles and Sukkot and all of those things. And so it's this harvest festival where the Jews would make, and still today, I think this happens, in backyards where you make the small hut, I guess, is that the right word for it? You make a hut out of, living materials and branches to think about the Exodus story as well. So John is going to use the Festival of Booths to sort of frame chapters 7 through 9. And I think that what would be best for next week, if we're all still good meeting during Holy Week, is we'll probably focus more on chapter 9 of John. But if you'd like to read a little bit of 7, you're welcome to read 7 and 8 if you like as well.